I do feel the Chinese are overly sensitive about Taiwan, and I feel that it's not appropriate for him to be telling us what we should think or believe about Taiwan either.
The Chinese ambassador to Ireland recently warned Irish politicians not to engage with Taiwan, suggesting it wasn't in Ireland's public interest. But is it right when a foreign government like China starts telling Irish elected representatives what they should and shouldn't do? Months after members of the Oireachtas visited Taiwan and met its democratically elected government, the issue drew a pointed response from Beijing. Gael TD Barry Ward pushed back, arguing that in a democracy, politicians answer to voters, not foreign powers. We spoke to Deputy Ward about that exchange, the ongoing closure of Ireland's trade office in Taipei, and whether China's influence in Ireland is shaping what can and can't be said about China itself. Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo, where we go beyond the headlines to examine how foreign influence, economic pressure and political fear quietly shape modern democracies. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. If you haven't already done so, we'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button and follow us, as it really helps with episode discovery. In a number of recent episodes, including The Anaconda in the Irish Chandelier, Democracy Unshielded and Too Afraid to Trade, we've explored how China's influence appears to be shaping government behaviour here in Ireland. One area where this is particularly visible is in relation to Taiwan. Ireland doesn't have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but it did maintain a trade office in Taipei until 2012, when it was closed under what the government described as austerity measures. Those measures are long gone, and today 16 EU member states, along with the EU itself, maintain active trade offices in Taiwan. Ireland does not, and despite that, it still appears not to be enough to appease the Chinese government. When Irish elected representatives travel to Taiwan, objections from Beijing tend to follow. The most recent example came in a letter published in the Irish Times on March 7th, where China's ambassador to Ireland argued that freedom of speech and travel should not be used by members of the Oireachtas to engage with what he described as China's Taiwan province. Barry Ward, who is Gael TD for Dún Laoghaire, chair of the European Affairs Committee and co-chair of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, was one of the parliamentarians who visited Taiwan last July. He responded publicly to the Chinese ambassador's letter, and we sat down with him to discuss that exchange, the continued absence of the Irish trade office in Taipei, and whether Chinese influence in Ireland is becoming more assertive. We also discussed the lack of legal safeguards around foreign interference and whether organisations like the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China have a role to play in raising awareness in Ireland. So thank you very much for taking the time to do the podcast.
Thanks for coming in.
So recently, back in March 7th, the Chinese ambassador to Ireland, Zhao Xiyuan, wrote a letter to the Irish Times stating that members of the houses of the Oireachtas should ensure their actions align with the state's official foreign policy, especially when travelling abroad and particularly in relation to Taiwan. He also said in the letter that freedom of speech and travel should not serve as a pretext for Oireachtas members to use their official titles to visit what he calls China's Taiwan province to meet self-styled leadership or to speak on Ireland's behalf. You're one of the TDs and senators who visited Taiwan in 2025, and you wrote a letter to the Irish Times in response to the ambassador. Can you tell us what you said in your response?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, the ambassador's comments were based on a misunderstanding of what a parliamentary democracy is. And it differs in standards from what happens in China in real terms. The first thing is that there's absolutely no obligation on an individual member of the Oireachtas to make comments or maintain views that accord with the state's position on something. It's the right of any TD or senator to disagree with the state's position. I do, and I even disagree with some of my party's positions. And that's what a representative democracy is. We are not all bound to believe in the same thing and have the same views. So that was the first thing. As you say, I was one of a number of TDs and senators who visited Taiwan. I have been a long-term advocate for Taiwanese independence. The Chinese do see it as part of their territory. And they're quite sensitive about suggestions otherwise. And that, I think, is what did inform the ambassador's letter and the suggestion that we were using our official title to do something nefarious or incorrect. And he's quite incorrect there. Any TD has an individual mandate from his or her constituents. They are answerable only to their constituents in real terms. And that's the point that I was making in my letter. I do feel the Chinese are overly sensitive about Taiwan. And I feel that it's not appropriate for him to be telling us what we should think or believe about Taiwan either.
He also said in the letter, by the way, that by failing to clarify their views or personal, members risk misappropriating the authority of the state and contradicting the code of conduct, which mandates that members must exercise their influence to advance the public interest. Not the first time we've heard this kind of rhetoric. Sounds similar to what a previous Ceann Comhairle wrote in a letter to the Oireachtas back in October of 2018. Some people might even say that what the ambassador wrote sounds like a veiled threat. What do you make of that statement?
Well, we're not strangers to veiled threats from Chinese administration. The letter that you're referring to was written before I was a member of the Oireachtas, but I'm aware of it. It was pretty robustly slapped down by members. The notion that the Ceann Comhairle or a member of government would tell a member of the legislature what they should think or what they should do or what they shouldn't think or what they shouldn't do is contrary to our democracy. And so that letter has had no effect on the way anybody behaves. And that's the way it should be. The Chinese administration is very quick to tell people what they should do and what they should think. They do it at home and they do it abroad. At home, they obviously have a very complex and sophisticated state infrastructure to suppress public opinion if it's the wrong way. Abroad, they use a different type of coercion. It's usually economic. And obviously China is a major world economic power, and so they have a lot of might. What's really interesting in the Irish context is we were one of the few, in fact, one of only 2 European countries with a trade surplus with China. So it actually matters quite a great deal if China is unhappy with Ireland from the point of view of our trade with China. But the day, I mean, you could say the same about America. You know, at the moment, America is behaving like a rogue power. The day that we make decisions as TDs on the basis of what foreign legislatures or foreign powers think is the day that we become a vassal state to those powers.
Yes, so you mentioned this, how the Chinese government engages with other countries. Some commentators call this China's authoritarian economic statecraft. And in this case, I mean, the ambassador it seems to be hinting at, visiting Taiwan is not in the public interest. In other words, China won't trade with countries that engage with Taiwan. And as you say, we have a large trade surplus with China. But I mean, if that's the case, if this is how China behaves, shouldn't we be backing off on engagement to protect ourselves and not engaging more? And I ask that in the context of the fact that Micheál Martin had a visit to China back in January and, is basically attempting to increase the engagement.
Yeah, and I support trade with China. I think China is actually a wonderful country. It's full of opportunity for Irish businesses. I have a problem with the way that China is run, and I have a problem with the Chinese Communist Party and the way that they conduct their affairs. There's an important distinction between the notion of a member of the Oireachtas going somewhere and Ireland making a statement about something. Firstly, I don't speak for the government and I don't speak for the Irish people. I do think it's in the public interest that we would be forthright in our opinions about the suppression of democratic societies like Taiwan. I am also critical of China in relation to the national security law in Hong Kong, in relation to the forced labour of Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province. There's a list of things I can give out about. It doesn't mean that I don't like China. It doesn't mean that I don't think we should ever talk to China or do business with China. The two are separate as far as I'm concerned. But the other thing to say is, if there is a veiled threat there, then that veiled threat should be also against the dozen or so European countries who have trade offices in Taipei. Ireland is not one of them, and that's something else I mentioned in the letter.
But does this mean we have caved in to China in their coercion from that perspective?
That is a question for government, for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
We're a member of the EU. We play this up. I mean, a few years ago, we were hailing our 50th anniversary of EU membership, and we're clearly out of step with other EU countries and the European office itself. in this regard?
I don't know if we're out of step. There is a European office there, so that you could argue that we benefit somewhat from the European presence in Taipei and Taiwan. I feel very strongly that we should be opening a trade office in Taipei. I think that we're missing a trick there, and there's lots of developed European economies who do that. That's a decision that is to be made within the Department of Trade as to whether that is a good thing for us to do or not. I don't think it's problematic. I don't think it contradicts even the one China policy that is Irish government policy. I don't agree with that policy either, by the way. So I would like to see us change that policy. In some ways, it's more difficult to do that in the current environment, but I hope we will revise that policy.
Because, I mean, after you and your delegation visited last July, and you met with the President Lai, he released a statement, or a press release after the meeting, saying that he would love to collaborate with Ireland on our national semiconductor strategy. And we all know Taiwan is the world leader when it comes to semiconductor production. So I'm curious if the government or the IDA has taken up Taiwan on this incredible offer.
Yeah. Well, again, you'll have to talk to the Department of Trade that, but there is an open opportunity for us there, and Ireland is not the only country competing to be collaborating with Taiwan in terms of all of the technological advances that they have there. Like when I was growing up, you would see made in Taiwan on plastic toys. Yeah. What's made in Taiwan now is much more sophisticated and much more valuable. So
we could be losing out by not having this engagement, right?
Well, I think we definitely are. And I've been very vocal on that in terms of issues that I've raised in the Dáil. I think there is a blinkered approach to Taiwan, and you may be right in that there is a desire not to, to compromise a relationship with China. I do understand that as well. I mean, it's easy for me to say the things I'm saying as an individual member of the Oireachtas. The government has an obligation to more than just their individual constituents. They have an obligation to the economy as a whole, to all the businesses that operate within the economy. They have an obligation not to do any harm to our economic prospects. So I understand why ministers would be less forthright about this than I would. But that is how I feel. And I think that China misbehaves on the international stage. On the one hand, they tell us they're a functioning member of the global community, that they respect international law. On the other hand, they blatantly don't.
And the other thing the ambassador brought up, you alluded to it already in his letter, was the so-called one China policy. You said in your response that you don't agree with the one China policy. But am I correct in saying that, whether or not one agrees with the one China policy, it doesn't preclude a country from having a representative office or a trade office in Taiwan?
Yeah. So the dozen or so countries I mentioned there, European countries who have trade offices in Taipei, to the best of my knowledge, their governments, and in fact most European governments, do accept the one China policy that China advocates for. What I'm much more interested in is the right to self-determination. And actually, if you look at Europe, there are countries within Europe who are quite sensitive on this issue. So if you take Spain, for example, the Sanchez government would be very, very circumspect about talking about self-determination, because they have provinces like Catalonia, like Galicia, who would toy with the idea of separating from the Kingdom of Spain. And so they really don't want us to explore too closely the notion of self-determination. But for Taiwan, which is in every respect separate from China, except for the fact that China claims it, and Taiwan, I suppose, tolerates that because of the military threat and the coercive threat that comes from China. But in terms of their economy, in terms of their politics, in terms of their society, their culture, even the script that they write their Mandarin with, they use the traditional characters, whereas Beijing uses the simplified characters. It's a different country, and they should be entitled to say that.
Yeah. But to be clear, the reason Ireland doesn't have a representative office or a trade office in Taiwan is because the Irish government chooses not to have one. It's nothing got to do with the one China policy.
Well, you're right. The reason we don't have one is because the Irish government has chosen not to open one. I don't think opening one contradicts the one China policy. There are sensitivities around that from the department's perspective that I understand. It's not for me to say why they have made that choice, but I suspect sensitivities to China is central to it.
We see these objections that come from the ambassador on these visits and so on. Some might say it's interference, whether it's the letter
in the newspaper or whether it's a phone call to the Interparliamentary Unit of the Oireachtas. But we've also seen newspaper reports on Garda investigations of Chinese agents building a political power network in Ireland. We've seen reports about closed-door meetings with members of the Chinese Communist Party and members of the Oireachtas. Do you think China is gaining influence in Ireland?
I don't, actually, which is not to say they aren't trying that. Can I say about the ambassador, who's a man I've met twice? He's here less than a year, so he's a relatively new ambassador. He's a very pleasant, polite, professional man. He is doing his job, and he obviously has to represent the view of Beijing and does so professionally. So I have no beef with him personally. I do think that there are different norms for how people behave relative to elected representatives in China and Ireland. I think that there are attempts by China at unofficial or sub-official levels to absolutely gain influence. We had also the examples of a Fujian police station on Capel Street. Yeah. And the way that works apparently is that you would press the button, you'd be connected to the Fujian head of police, and they would tell you you're wanted back in China to face charges. And the implicit or explicit statement is that if you don't come back, the people connected to you still in Fujian will suffer as a result. So that kind of coercion has no place in a democracy like Ireland. But you're right, the Chinese are trying this, and it's not Ireland alone. Like Lithuania has suffered hugely at the hands of Chinese efforts to disrupt their economy, to launch cyber attacks against them. So it's happening all over the world, and China has no bones about how it will wield its influence at sub-official levels or with subterfuge or with attempts to gain people.
I guess my question about the letter to the newspaper and the phone calls to the Interparliamentary Unity of the Oireachtas and all the other things that probably go on that we don't get to see reported is, are these influencing the government or members of the Oireachtas in how they may approach China, engage with Taiwan? Do you think it causes them to modify their behaviour?
I don't, actually. Certainly, I don't see evidence for that. So the Interparliamentary Alliance in China, which I co-chair with my colleague Malcolm Byrne, that has a growing number of members of the Oireachtas joining it, for starters. I think the government is well aware of issues with China, with issues of rule of law and human rights behaviours by China. But in the same way that Micheál Martin went to the Oval Office and talked to Donald Trump and didn't feel the need to raise every grievance that we have with the way American foreign policy is being operated at the moment, nor does he have to sit down with Wang Yi or Xi Jinping and start with, we have the following problems. That's not the way you conduct business on the international political stage. There has to be a pragmatism to it. And I think it's appropriate that our foreign minister or our Taoiseach or any other minister going to China can speak privately and frankly to their counterpart without thumping the table. And I saw this a little bit when Simon Coveney was Minister of Foreign Affairs. I had a constituent, Richard O'Halloran, who was under house arrest de facto in China over something he had not done. It was really a commercial dispute involving a Chinese company, and he was being used as a pawn. But I met very frequently with Simon about this, and Simon engaged directly with Wang Yi on it. But the point is, you can't go into a meeting with the Chinese foreign minister and thump the table and tell him if he doesn't do X, Y, Z, you will do X, Y, Z, because the Chinese don't respond to that. Pride is very important. Honour is very important in terms of their dealings in that way. And you have to meet them in a way that is respectful but firm. Mm-hmm. And that's the way to do it. So it's entirely reasonable to say, yes, we will trade with China. Yes, we will conduct X, Y, Z exchanges with China. But we will also reserve the right to say to China, when the time comes and when the moment arises, this is something that we have a difficulty with, and we don't think that is a reasonable set of behaviour. So you can write letters to the Irish Times all day long, and obviously the Irish Times letter page is much written and read and all the rest. But I don't actually think that affects government policy, and I don't think Irish people are taken in by it either.
Okay, but I want to come back to like two of those examples you mentioned there. Micheál Martin's visit to meet Xi Jinping and also his visit to the Oval Office. You know, for example, prior to Micheál Martin's visit to the Oval Office for St. Patrick's Day, there was lots of discussion about whether he should go or not here in Ireland, you know, the morality of it given the US-Israeli war on Iran. But if you contrast that with his visit to Beijing, a few weeks prior at the beginning of January. Very little discussion at all, even though we have China's horrendous human rights record, as you alluded to the many examples earlier. I think the only kind of mentions of things I saw were yourself and Malcolm Byrne, who you mentioned, brought up the case of Jimmy Lai's imprisonment in the Dáil around the time of Micheál Martin's visit, but very little else. I mean, his visit was discussed, but at a very shallow level. My question to you on this is discussing China or criticising China openly a taboo topic in Ireland?
I don't think so. I just think that the United States and its politics is more to the forefront of our media and our minds and our understanding. There's no language barrier. Lots of people have family and friends living in the United States. They're much more proximate to public affairs issues in the United States, so they have a greater understanding, and it's in the news all the time. By the same token, I would say that the visit of Micheál Martin to the Oval Office is not about the relationship between Micheál Martin and Donald Trump. It's about the relationship between Ireland and the United States. And the day that we snub that meeting is the day that that meeting ends. It would be incredibly myopic for any Taoiseach to say, I'm not going to go to Washington because I don't agree with X, Y, or the following 15 things that the United States administration is doing. That is not the way to conduct international relations. And the same goes for China. I would never have said that Micheál Martin should not have gone to meet Xi Jinping. All I would ask is that when he's there, he is not behind the door about calling out Chinese human rights abuses.
But in terms of discussing China openly more in Ireland and it being taboo, I mean, I want to give you another example. One of the topics I covered in a recent podcast was the protest against China's mega embassy in central London. And there was a big protest there at the end of January. I went along to see what was happening, observe the protests, and I was quite surprised by the level of opposition to China among civic groups, political parties, about China and China's behaviour. And because of that opposition, there's a certain amount of discourse you see and discussion that happens. But it seems like a huge contrast between that level of discourse you get in the UK versus the level of discourse in China in Ireland.
I think two things. Firstly, I don't think there's a taboo in the Dáil. I don't think people are afraid to say what they think about China. I just think fewer people have central beliefs in terms of China the way they do about the United States, for the simple reason that the United States is more present in our lives than China is, even though China is a huge part of our economy and all the rest. In terms then of the public discourse, the same goes. The United States is what gets covered in our papers, on our news, and when you go to the UK, you're dealing, first of all, with a much bigger country. You're dealing with a population that is 12, 13 times the size of ours. So you have many more people to pursue particular issues that they're interested in. That's a wonderful thing for the UK, but trying to find room in Irish media for every issue is difficult. The media landscape is simply not as large as it is in America or the UK or France or Germany. And so it's not that there aren't people who are disquieted by Chinese behaviour. There absolutely are. It's just that they don't have the same critical mass they might in other larger countries. And the same is true because the Dáil is a reflection of the state, if you like. So the same is true in the Dáil. There may not be as many people who want to comment on America or on China as want to comment on America.
So it's the same true also for IPAC in Ireland. So IPAC is the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. I saw them play a fairly major role in that mega embassy protest in London.
And they're based in London. So, yeah.
But yourself is a member, and there are about 11, 12 or so members in the Oireachtas. But we don't see the same level of, I guess, engagement as I've seen in the UK. Now, is it just a size thing, a smaller country?
Parliamentary engagement.
Just on issues in public discourse and so on.
Well, first of all, IPAC is kind of based in London, and the Secretariat of IPAC is in London. There are over 30 parliamentary groups around the world who are members of IPAC. It is growing all the time. What IPAC is about, again, it's not an anti-China organisation by any means. The people who are part of IPAC generally have a deep respect and love for China. The issue is more, as I say, for me, the same. The issue is with the way China conducts its business. Now, I suppose more the Chinese government conducts its business. I don't think it's reasonable to expect there to be big protests in every city. I'd love if there were. I'd love if people were more aware of what China does and doesn't do, indeed. I'd love if people were more aware of the fact that China speaks out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, tells everybody how it's the centre of innovation, but never tells anyone how it has no respect whatsoever for copyright or intellectual property rights. It talks about being a part of the global community while at the same time suppressing people in its own within its own borders. So it's hugely problematic as a state, as far as I'm concerned. I say that, others say that in here. But just because everybody isn't saying it doesn't mean that anybody is prevented from saying it, and it doesn't mean people don't know about it.
But is there a role for IPAC in Ireland to raise the awareness?
Yeah, there is, and we're we as co-chair of IPAC in Ireland. I have a monthly meeting with my colleagues around the world. We do it online, and time changes so that everybody gets to do it during the waking hours. And we meet once a month. We have discussions about issues. We have updates from each country on what we're doing, on whether we're raising issues. The Czech Senate, for example, last month passed a motion of censure against China in relation to one particular issue. So, these things are happening, and we're kept abreast of it. IPAC is a parliamentary organisation, though, so it's necessarily limited in terms of its reach within the Irish societal body of opinion. But there's always more we can do to show people the problems. And remember, the things we complain about with China are not our opinions. They're not things that we think about China. They're things that are independently reinforced by UN reports, by Human Rights Watch reports, by loads of international authority who have no skin in the game, no basis to lie about what's happening in China, who have gone into particular scenarios and drawn up reports that are objectively true. That's what we base our views on, and it's always better if we can spread them to more and more people.
I suppose similar to the UK, we're seeing more concerns being expressed by Ireland's intelligence services now about the threat of China and Chinese espionage in Ireland. For example, the Irish Military Intelligence Service has described China as a hostile state actor and a concern for its organisation. They've told Irish universities to be aware of China. As mentioned earlier, we've seen newspaper reports of Chinese agents building a political power network in Ireland, and we see members of the Chinese Communist Party meeting behind closed doors with members of the Oireachtas. There's been talk about a foreign interference transparency register. Do you know what's going on with that?
I don't really, and I don't either know about the meetings behind closed doors of members of the Oireachtas of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, I meet people.
Yeah, this was reported in the Sunday Times.
But I just don't know about it. I'm aware of the reports of it. I don't know who's involved, and I meet people, Maria, behind closed doors all the time. Today I had a meeting with 25 Francophonie ambassadors behind closed doors, but we're not hiding what's said either. So I understand concerns about that. I also recognise that the Defence Forces have recognised the danger that China poses. Last July I met with the Director of National Security for Taiwan. They fully expect to be invaded by China. But when he says that, he doesn't mean that there are going to be tanks landing on Taiwan to blow up the place. They're talking about cyber attacks. They're talking about a situation where they're laid low by the cyber attacks, and those cyber attacks can just as easily come to our door as they can to Taiwan's. So there is a real danger, and I'm not sure everybody in Ireland is aware of just how present that danger is and how proximate that danger is. We need to prepare, and that requires investment in the same security platforms that we need in lots of other areas.
And do you think this foreign interference transparency register is a good step in that direction?
I do, and I think it's important from the point of view of just being honest about where we all stand. Some people will say it's fear-mongering. I don't think it is. I think it's preparedness. I think it's more about reality and recognising where things lie.
I mean, the EU have also pointed this out, and the EU actually applaud Ireland for its strict national rules on lobbying with organisations like SIPO and so on, but is highlighting that specific regulations for foreign interference at the national level are still lacking, potentially allowing hidden lobbying efforts to go on. I suppose there's no chance of this being put in place in advance of our taking up the European presidency.
Not now, no. But I mean, I would certainly support the notion that we should be constantly reviewing that. I mean, These are rules that were brought in to a large extent by Enda Kenny in his post-crash government, and they're very important because they do bring transparency to the discussions that are happening. I met with somebody, for example, last week, and at the end of the meeting he said to me, do I need to make an entry into the lobbying register about this? And my answer is, well, why wouldn't you? There's no disadvantage to somebody saying, I met with ex-TD or ex-senator or whoever it might be, and I discussed this with them. Like, talking to people, having discussions is how we all come to understand different perspectives. We should never be ashamed of that. If there's a conflict of interest, let's be honest about it. But what you're talking about is a different thing, and it's not really properly covered by our legislation at the moment, where you have a foreign government that comes in essentially to, if you're not in the meeting, you don't know exactly what's said, but possibly to leverage power that they have over us to force us or to encourage us, if I can put it that way, to do one thing that maybe we shouldn't do, or not to do something that maybe we should do. So I'd much rather see greater transparency if that's at all possible.
Okay, well, let's definitely hope that shows up sooner rather than later. Anything else you'd like to add, or anything I missed?
No, I mean, again, for me, since I've been a member of IPAC, I have been at pains to point out, I've spent a bit of time in China, I have travelled in China, I've done some work in Hong Kong, and I think it's a magnificent country. It's full of incredibly hardworking, innovative people who have a culture that is older than most world cultures in terms of how far they go back and how many things they've invented and developed and pioneered. And I would hate for Ireland to lose the opportunity to interact with such a sophisticated culture just because they have a government at the moment that suppresses them, that doesn't play fair, that and which acts illegally a lot of the time. I'd much rather see a situation where we were dealing with a government in China that actually had bona fides in relation to the mandate from its people.
It's ironic then, though, that a lot of Chinese culture is still available and accessible in Taiwan under a democratic government, and the Irish government could be engaging with Taiwan a lot more and benefiting from that.
And the reality is that Taiwanese people are ethnically Han Chinese. They're essentially people who were displaced after the establishment of the Mao Zedong government and reign. So, and they travel to China all the time. There is a functionality between the two, but there is this artificial claim by Beijing and the CCP that Taiwan is somehow part of theirs, and they refuse to recognize what the ambassador referred to as so-called political leaders. I mean, they are political leaders. You don't have to like it, but they are democratically elected political leaders of the people in Taiwan, and they are far more advanced in that regard than Beijing.
Okay. Well, Deputy Barry Ward, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Neil.
That's Deputy Barry Ward, who is Gael TD for Dún Laoghaire and co-chair of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. My sincere thanks to Deputy Ward for taking the time to share his valuable insights with us on Perspectives with Neilo. In the closing paragraph of his letter, the Chinese ambassador noted how both China and Ireland have achieved, quote, independence and modernisation through the struggle and hard work of the people, and that there is reason to believe Ireland can understand and support China's efforts towards national reunification. End quote. As we have mentioned many times in the past, Taiwan has never been part of the People's Republic of China, and therefore seeking reunification where there hasn't previously been unification is a historical contradiction. You can't return to a place you've never been. But in the world of high-stakes diplomacy, these word games are used to mask a much more aggressive reality, the desire for control over a democracy that has paved its own way for decades. Furthermore, it should be obvious that Ireland has far more in common with the democratic island nation of Taiwan than the authoritarian People's Republic of China. Ireland of all countries understands the difference between political claims and lived political reality. If you'd like to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode, as well as the links to the Ambassador's letter, Deputy Ward's response, and indeed our own response, we've placed these links and additional information on our blog site at pwneilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. We'd also love to hear your feedback on our discussion. Do you think the Chinese ambassador to Ireland is out of line by telling members of the Irish Parliament what they can and cannot do? drop us a comment on our Perspectives with Neilo social media pages or whichever app you use to listen to the podcast. You can also contact us via our blog at pwneilo.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you don't want to miss any future episodes, don't forget to hit that subscribe or follow button. This is the best way to support us and really helps motivate us to keep producing content. But that's where we leave it for now. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, slán agus beannacht.